One of the basic ideas of a free and democratic society is the government is held accountable in large part by the media. So if the government gets to control what the media is and who's in the media, then that's not really free media, right?
Is Canada heading down an authoritarian path? We know that Justin Trudeau admires China. He said so himself.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China because their basic dictatorship.
But how deep does that relationship go? Trudeau is willing to defend China, even amidst their egregious behavior in covering up and lying about the coronavirus. Trudeau's health minister has praised China on multiple occasions, and his foreign minister refused to name Taiwan, even when asked directly about Taiwanese aid to Canada. Perhaps worst of all, Trudeau is slowly creeping Canada towards a government-owned, government-managed, and government-controlled media landscape, just like in communist-autocratic China. I cover all of this and more with my guest today, Spencer Fernando. Spencer is an independent journalist and has built one of the fastest-growing political websites in Canada. His news and opinion site, spencerfernando.com, strips the news of its left liberal bias and provides facts and insightful analysis for his conservative-minded audience. Spencer credits his success to his ability to tell the truth to Canadians and his willingness to bring insight to issues the establishment media and what he calls corrupt elites prefer to hide, spin, or ignore. In my conversation today with Spencer, we discuss how China is taking advantage of Canada, how they are corrupting our weak leadership, and what needs to happen post-COVID-19. We also discuss what conservatives need to do to build a stronger civil society, to combat leftist ideas and politicians, and for the Conservative Party of Canada to win again. Okay, well, Spencer Fernando, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you on the show. How's it going?
Not too bad. Yourself?
I like your setup. I love the patriotic Canadian flag draped over. I don't know if that's hiding something like intentionally or if that's just...
We'll leave that to people's imagination.
Great. Well, Spencer, before we get into sort of more of the depth of the conversation we'll have today, I wanted to just ask you about what your background is, where you came from, because I just sort of all of a sudden noticed you on the scene on social media. You have your own website, which provides really factual, very quick, updated news stories and sort of opinion pieces about Canadian federal politics. But what were you doing before that, and what led you to launching your own website?
Well, I've been involved in politics for a while with various political parties. And I always got into trouble because I was a little too opinionated and maybe independent-minded. That's not often not what they want in partisan environments. So ran into a fair amount of trouble within political parties, and then just got to the point where I said, I may as well just write my own stuff, share my own opinions, see if people like it. And it turns out a lot of people did, and it's worked out pretty well.
Yeah, I find that there's such a demand for conservative news and opinion. And I think you kind of have to walk a fine line. Some people say, well, news should be objective. It shouldn't be coming from any political persuasion or opinion. But the reality is that most of the news in Canada is written from a left-wing liberal perspective. The quotes that they choose to include, the spin that they put, the headline that they choose, even just, who they choose to include quotes from. It's all coming from a basic liberal bias. And so I feel like what your site provides is sort of a flip side of that. What kind of brought you into that journalism world, aside from just not wanting to be muzzled by a political party?
Well, I had worked for both the Manitoba and the newspaper, the University of Manitoba, and then the Uniter for a while at the University of Winnipeg. So that was a good experience, both just for understanding journalism, but also for learning about the way it works. And one thing you see is, a lot of the people who work there, they're nice people. They feel like they're objective. They're good human beings, and that's fine. But they tend to be left-wing people. So it's the numbers game, right? I'd say at least 8 out of 10 of people who go into the media, they're left-wing people. That's their bias. And people can't really shut their bias down. They might think they do, but it still comes out. As you say, who they cover, what they say, the way they write things. So being able to see kind of the people who end up being the media later on and seeing that at an early point really gives a good perspective on the reason the media is the way it is today. And they're able to mask it very well because they go work for an official institution like CBC or CTV. And a lot of people look at that and say, oh, that's just the media. They must be unbiased. And they see a more right-wing or what looks like a more right-wing outlet and say, oh, it's just unbiased media versus really biased media. So I think having that experience and seeing the kind of people that went into media does help kind of, show what the big problem is now.
Why do you think that is, Spencer? Why do you think so many left-wing people are drawn to the art of politics? And what can we do perhaps to encourage more young conservatives who are trying to choose a career path or who are, trying to figure out, should I go into politics? Should I, how can we kind of encourage more young people who, again, not necessarily big C partisan conservatives, but just people who have sort of a basic understanding of the importance of tradition and institutions, the rule of law, people who defer more to, wanting to go down the traditional path as opposed to jumping on every new progressive trend. How do you think we can flip that, or do you think it's just a foregone thing that left-wing people will go into the media?
Well, I think it would have to be done outside the university system. Universities tend to be left-wing environments in the first place. So, and then there's, there were some conservatives like myself and others who would go into the media, but a lot would just leave, right? Because you go in, almost everyone else is left wing. You see the bias already. It can be a tough environment. So I think it would have to be done within the private sector, creating kind of journalism schools, more conservative journalism schools, however you want to call it. But, being honest about, yes, there is somewhat of a bias in this institution, and that's because there's a bias in the establishment media. It needs to be pushed back against. So I think there'd have to be really just an effort by people who, have resources to start funding some of these things. And I'm sure we'll get to it later, but that's one of the big problems I see with the Conservative Party is that they have so much fundraising. They get so much money, and yet they seem to just constantly complain, oh, the media is unbiased, instead of really doing anything about it. So I'm sure we'll get to that later.
Yeah, we can. And one of the things, I have the same experience as you, Spencer. I have a lot of friends from university that went down the journalism path, and, almost unanimously, they're all lefties. Back then, they were sort of more open about it. Now they pretend to be more objective. But even I have a couple friends, I'll tell you, that back in the day, back in university and when we were younger, they were sort of ardent libertarians or pretty right-wing conservatives. And now after a decade in the media, in the mainstream media, they basically turned into like Trump derangement, lefties. And it's interesting to watch how that can happen. But I almost wonder that just the environments of those media companies either turns you against conservatism, or that's a calculated bet that in order to get ahead and in order to get promoted and in order to get into a good position in media, you have to be left wing. So I think the problem could even go deeper. But I do like the idea of having some kind of a framework in the private sector to promote young journalists who do come from more that conservative persuasion. And we're going to talk about that because one of the things I really want to get into with you in this interview is looking at the media landscape in Canada and how independent outlets like yourself and like us over at True North, but before we get into that, I think it's important during these lockdowns and, we've all been stuck inside for over 2 months now and watching this, deadly virus sweep through our country and kill thousands of our fellow Canadians, but then also seeing our economy completely get locked down, absolute, crackdown on basic rights and freedoms in this country without even a meaningful debate. So I just want to get your take, Spencer, on, what do you make of these lockdowns? Do you think that the Trudeau government has done what they've had to do? Do you think that they've done anything that you would consider to be good and right? Or do you maintain a very critical position on them? And also, what do you think the world is going to look like at the end of all this? Do you think it's going to be going back to the same old, or do you think there'll be a meaningfully different world post-coronavirus?
Well, I think with the lockdowns, it basically became something that was necessary because of the failure at the border. If you look at Taiwan, for example, Taiwan never really imposed a big nationwide lockdown, and they've had, I think, 99 deaths, or 99 cases, some extremely low number, and it's basically gone in Taiwan. And that's because they shut the border down early. Australia and New Zealand also have not had to be as harsh. And it's very interesting if you look, the countries that have done the best are the countries that are most connected to China, because they know not to believe China, and they know not to believe any institution who's tied to China. So the lockdown in Canada, basically, because the border wasn't taken care of, because there wasn't screening at the airport, basically became the only option. And now I think a lot of politicians, across the spectrum, I think the big fear for them now is if they lift it too soon, they'll be accused of, oh, you let people die. If you lift it too late, then, oh, you destroyed the economy. So I think they're all kind of looking at each other and trying to avoid blame by just kind of copying each other and not being the first to do something. So again, we wouldn't have needed lockdowns if the border was stronger, if they had actually done what they said they would with airport screening. Of course, we know they didn't. The provinces had to send people to take care of that. So I think Trudeau certainly failed at the border, and that let the virus into the country. And then that left the only choice is a lockdown for people.
Yeah, Spencer, it's interesting that you compare Canada to a number of other countries internationally, like Taiwan and Australia, because I feel like what happens so much in Canada is that the media commentators and the sort of, politicians and elites, they always compare Canada to the US. So they look at, in this case, look at what Trump has done. And as far as reopening, they say, oh, it's mostly these Republican-led governors in these southern states, and look at how reckless it is. But we don't look at the fact that Germany also reopened their economy and they haven't seen a huge surge in coronavirus cases or a second wave. And, you look at Sweden, who, again, a lot of people on the left will look to Sweden as a model for their social welfare state. But yet when it came to coronavirus, they completely ignored the recommendations of the World Health Organization. And now the World Health Organization is actually applauding them, saying that they took the right approach by sort of empowering citizens to do the right thing and allowing businesses to adapt to the situation. So it's interesting that we're in this paralysis right now where nobody wants to reopen out of fear of being the one premier or, the government that said reopen only to see a second wave. But, there is a sort of imperial data out there. There's sort of a live experiment of all these different countries doing different things. And we can kind of say, okay, things didn't look so bad when they reopened. So do you think that then that the government is dragging its heels on reopening? If you were advising the prime minister right now, would you tell him to reopen, or would you be cautious?
Well, first I'd tell him to resign, but if we're just pretending it's regular advice, I would say you leave it to the provinces. The provinces know best what's going on. Because Manitoba, I think we had 2 or 3 days in a row with just one new case or 0 cases. And in Quebec, it's still very bad in some parts. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Then, of course, with provinces, the issue has to be interprovincial travel, right? If one province does well, another province does terrible, and then people are traveling back and forth, obviously you're going to have a problem. But I would leave it to the provinces. I think if you look every step of the way, the federal government has really failed for the most part. Provinces have stepped up and done a good job, but the federal government hasn't done a good job. So I would say just decentralize things and let the provinces make their own choices.
Well, I'm really glad you made that point, because I haven't had the latest numbers. So this is just as of May 14th, before the long weekend. So the numbers are a bit outdated, but more or less they're correct. So in Canada, we have the total number of deaths, 5,472. Again, like you said, the bulk of that is in Quebec, where there has been 3,351 deaths, 40,000 cases. I'm in Toronto and Ontario, similarly high numbers, 21,500 cases, confirmed cases with 1,798 deaths. Now, for you, Spencer, you're in Winnipeg. So when you look at the Manitoba numbers, throughout this entire pandemic and crisis, you've had 289 cases in Manitoba and 7 deaths. 7 deaths. So just as someone as a citizen living in a place where you've really not been impacted by the virus itself, but the actual lockdowns have caused, I'm sure, all kinds of economic hardship, particularly for small business owners and for hourly workers who work in hospitality. How does that feel? I just can't imagine having such small numbers and really having the disease not impacting your community, and yet you still have all the repercussions as if you were living in New York City or Montreal or Toronto, or places where there is a legitimate fear where I live that if I take my family out and we get too close to someone else, that we could get the virus. But I can't imagine that would be a realistic concern for you in Winnipeg.
Yeah, well, in some ways it's a bit of a timing issue because we saw on the coast it got very bad. And before many people even came into Manitoba, there was a lockdown. So it's always kind of the chicken or the egg thing, right? is it not a problem in Manitoba because the lockdown happened early, or is the lockdown not necessary because it's not a problem at all? I still think erring on the side of caution was for governments at the beginning when they didn't really know what was going on. I'm sure there would have been more cases in Manitoba if we just pretended, oh, there's no threat, there's no issue. Because it does just take one person, right? One person affects another person, then it starts spreading like wildfire. But I think that's going to be the question now is how do you open up parts of the country when other parts are still closed down? And because the economy in Canada is connected, right? So if much of the U.S. is locked down, if much of Canada is locked down, then sure, Manitoba can open up, but the economy is still going to be hit. It's the same in Taiwan. Taiwan had no official government lockdowns, but they still had massive economic damage because a lot of people were just choosing to stay inside anyway. So there's kind of an aspect where, yes, the government has done damage, obviously, with the lockdowns, but I don't think a lot of people would be fine. Like, yeah, I used to say in Toronto, if the government just lifted the lockdown today, it's not like the economy would just recover instantly. A lot of people would say, well, I still don't trust what's going on. I'm going to stay inside. So I think everyone's kind of trying to fumble their way through it and figure out the best way to go. But, it's still quite unknown at this point.
See, I would rather them fumble their way through it, Spencer, and say, we're going to reopen. But again, it's up to the judgment of each and every Canadian, because then at least recognizes our sort of individual responsibility and, dignity as humans to say, OK, it's up to me to make that decision. And I know many people who are the people who are the loudest people complaining that they don't want to reopen. Those people are more than welcome to just stay at home. No one's forcing them to go out back into their lives and go out and about like they used to, especially with the federal government so willing to extend these emergency benefit payments that those don't seem like they're drying up anytime soon. So I find it a strange argument for people who are so dead set on remaining closed, because again, it's still up to them. They can still choose, especially since we know that elderly people are the biggest victims. They could still choose to remain socially distanced from elderly grandparents. They could still choose not to put their children back in school or daycare. It's still ultimately up to individuals, even if the feds announced that they wanted to reopen. So, Spencer, what do you think the world's going to look like at the end of these lockdowns? Do you think we're going to just go back to exactly how life was in February 2020? Or do you think when these lockdowns end, it will be met with a new world of sort of different norms, different ideas around traveling and commuting and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think it's going to be different, especially because I think, as you say, what's going to have to happen is the lockdowns do need to be lifted at some point, and people make their own choices. Obviously, we've learned a lot about the virus, so people are armed with a lot more knowledge now. But there's going to be a gap between when the lockdown comes down and when there's a vaccine, if there is a vaccine. It could be a year, 2 years, 3, who knows. So society is going to have to change somewhat. I think a lot of people are just going to make their own decisions. Restaurants are going to say, if people even are fine going back to restaurants, it's going to be limited seating, spaced out seating. Air travel is going to change somewhat. I think, forget one airline in the States says they're going to be at 66% capacity when they get back to, full steam, whatever it is. So that'll be a big change. People will be more socially distanced. A lot of events I don't think will come back for quite a long time. I can't imagine stadiums filled with people watching, football, arenas full of people watching hockey. So I think that'll be a big change, but I think it's going to be kind of a trial and error process. And I think one way social media is helpful is we can all see what's happening in every jurisdiction. People can share videos, share their own experience. So we're all kind of learning from each other. So we may see, here's a practice that works good in one place that opened up. Here's something that went bad in another place. And we'll just kind of, as I said, fumble our way through it.
Well, and hopefully we can provide enough shame on local bylaw officers and local police who are doing absurd things like issuing tickets to a family that was rollerblading in a parking lot, or a mom that was holding her baby for too long in a public park. I was out in the park near my house yesterday, and the City of Toronto guys were there picking up all the picnic tables. I guess picnic tables pose some kind of a risk against Canadians, so we can't have picnic tables out in the park. I guess they're trying to just discourage people from going to the park, but it seemed like a little bit mean-spirited, and I would even say borderline fascist for the government officials to come in and take away places for people to sit in the park. It seems a little bit over the top. Well, I hope you're right about the social media helping us guide through it. I think one of the other big issues, Spencer, to come out of the coronavirus lockdown is the future of our relationship with China. I know you've been hammering away on this point on your website and in pieces for the Post Millennial. What do you think Canada's relationship with China looks like when this pandemic's over?
Well, it should look like almost non-existent. I think if we, we've got to realize there's different kinds of trade, right? If you're trading for luxury products, say you're shipping a car overseas, that's not really a huge problem, because your economy is not going to be destroyed if all of a sudden you can't ship luxury products. But if you're talking about, personal protective equipment, energy, telecom infrastructure, military infrastructure, that's the kind of stuff you cannot be dependent on a foreign country for, especially a country like China that just simply is ideologically opposed to Canada, very hostile government with the Chinese Communist Party. So the relationship should be very much, reduced. All dependence we have on them, I think, should be eliminated to the greatest extent possible. You can't do that instantly, but you can take real steps to do it right away. And, we're going to have to look back and say, okay, well, who are the countries we can trust? The United States, Australia, the UK, New Zealand, much of Europe, countries that have the same basic values as we do. That's who we need to trade with and have a relationship with. Taiwan, India, countries that still have some similarities to us, but just being dependent on China is just not acceptable. Look at what's happening in Australia right now. They pretty tame. They said, there needs to be an investigation of China when this is all over. And China's now shutting down a bunch of imports. They're basically saying, hey, if you keep pushing for an investigation, Australia, we're going to destroy your economy. So how can you think it's smart to make yourself dependent on a country that the second you do one thing they get a little bit offended by, they try to destroy you? So the relationship should be really non-existent, but I wouldn't be shocked if Trudeau tries to go in a very different direction.
Well, speaking of Trudeau, I mean, it almost seems like the rest of the world is wising up to China, like you said. I think Australia made a very strategic error over the last decade or so in massively expanding their trade. Now, Australia doesn't have the luxury that Canada does, and that our neighbor is the world's biggest economy and 350 million consumers just right there. So Canada's lucky in that we still maintain our largest trading partnership with the United States. Australia has taken a bit of a gamble to rely heavily on China, and I think that they are paying for that. But you still see leadership and sort of a backbone from Australia and saying enough is enough. In the United States under Trump, we've definitely seen sort of a big resurgence in standing up to China and trying to hold China to account. With Trump, but under Trudeau, we still see this appeasement, even with all the information that we now know about the coronavirus and sort of early days with the Chinese government lying about it being transmissible, with their data constantly changing. We had Trudeau's health minister saying that there's no reason not to trust China's data. Well, like a couple of days later, China went and changed their own data, so they don't even trust their own data, but Trudeau does. And then you had a couple of weeks later, Patty Hajdu saying that she praised China not for its response now, but for its early response. Well, Spencer, I know you were watching it closely. In the early days, they were kidnapping whistleblowers, arresting scientists, disappearing journalists. The crackdown on human rights is just absolutely appalling. So why is it that we have a federal government in Canada with Trudeau that's so willing and so eager to carry water for China? Why do we have this strange relationship where the rest of the world is moving away from this bad actor and this adversarial communist regime, and Canada's just not really catching on to that and continues to prop up and appease this government? Why is that?
Yeah, well, there's also the vaccine, right? I mean, they've decided of all countries to partner with on a vaccine, we'll partner with China, which a bit of an odd decision given what's taken place. I think there's a lot of questions about it, and the question has to be, I think there needs to be an investigation. That's what I talked to Ezra about before. And we need to know, are some people, are they compromised? Are they bought off? Or if that's not the case, are they just idiots? Because really that's what they've got to be, right? So I think there's some people who, it's like anything that's not Western, they find interesting, right? And I think that's kind of part of the attitude problem with some of the people in the Liberal government. It's like, if it's not the States or Europe or the UK, then it must be great. It's so exotic and interesting, right? And you can see that a bit with the way they respond to Trump. So Trump will tweet something, say about Islam, and they'll get really offended. Like, this is a disgrace. This is fascism, right? And then just silence on China having 1 million Muslim people in concentration camps. It's like, no, that's not really our problem. So this idea that China gets to get away with everything and be held to a different standard is just absurd. And, the point you mentioned about Australia, it's very interesting. Australia is showing much more courage versus China than we are in Canada, despite the fact that Australia has almost everything to lose by it. And Canada, if we got, it would be tough if we got cut off from trade with China just completely, right? Just say today China said no more trade, but our economy would still survive. I mean, most of our trade is either internal or with the United States. Australia, a very different position. So our country's really, because of Trudeau, acting like cowards and just bowing down to China constantly. And we don't even have much to lose by being cut off from China. Whereas Australia, with everything to lose, is being a lot more courageous. So I think at some point, Canadians should start getting embarrassed by this. I mean, you look at the polls, people obviously don't like China. They don't trust China. And, look at our history. We've been a country that stands up for freedom, stands up for democracy, stands up for the rule of law. And to give in to China and just roll over for them is kind of a disgrace to everything we're supposed to stand for.
Well, I'll just make one caveat. In Canada's history, we have been a country that stands up for freedom and democracy, unless there's a prime minister with the last name Trudeau, because I know Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre, also had a strange affinity for countries like Cuba and their communist dictatorship. So perhaps Trudeau is carrying on that legacy. You mentioned a conversation that you're having with Ezra. You're talking about Ezra Levant over at the Rebel Media. And I watched that interview that you did with him. And it was interesting because it was pointed out that a story from 10 years ago did an investigation, found that there was about 1,000 spies, known Chinese spies in Canada. They were mainly focused on corporate espionage and these kind of things. But that is a really surprising, startling number that I don't think that Canadians are aware of. And again, that number is 10 years dated. So is there any idea of whether China has a surveillance or an intelligence presence in Canada? I'm sure they do. You don't have to watch a lot of spy movies to know that is the reality for these adversarial regimes like Iran and China. They still play that game. But did you think that there was any concern that perhaps part of the reason why Trudeau and the Liberal government is so willing to play ball with China is because somewhere along the line someone's compromised? That's sort of the conversation you're having with Ezra. Why don't you shine some light on that?
Yeah, the question is we don't know, right? And when you see very odd behavior that doesn't really make sense, you need to investigate it, right? When it comes from your government. So I think that's why we need to have an investigation, a very strong investigation, and get to the bottom of it. So either some people are compromised or they're just, as I said before, they're just idiots, or useful idiots, as the communists would call them. But I think if you look, at the problem, 10 years ago they thought there might be 1,000 agents? I'm sure it's way more now. I mean, Xi Jinping has dramatically escalated all their espionage efforts in their attempt to control other countries. Canada would be seen by China as a foothold right next to the United States, right? So there's a big strategic issue there. We have a lot of resources that they would love to control, big problem there. And I think about 1/3 of all foreign students from China are in Canada. In the whole world, 1/3 are in Canada. So we know that they try the whole united front thing. And there's a lot of Chinese Canadians who are saying to the government, look, we need you to stand up for us. We have a serious problem. They basically get pressure from both sides because you have the Chinese Communist Party will threaten, even people in Canada will threaten them if they criticize China, will threaten their families still living in China. And then they get no support from the government, who just rolls over for China. So basically they're getting totally screwed over. And they're saying, look, we need the government to call out this united front. We need them to expose it and stand up for people in the country. And so far, Trudeau refuses to do so. So, I wouldn't be shocked if he's not bought off at all, but he's just an idiot, like his father. Very, every communist he came across, he somehow loved. But that's why we need to investigate. We need to know whether these people are just fools or whether something more sinister is happening.
And it's an absolutely essential point that you raised there about how the people who are really left in a terrible situation and abandoned by their government are Canadians who fled China, Canadians who left China either this generation or the last. I remember when the Hong Kong protesters were happening, like I grew up in Vancouver, there's a very large presence of Chinese immigrants and members of Chinese diaspora that live there. And when the protests were happening, it almost seemed like a part of this civil war that was happening across the world ended up in Vancouver and in Richmond and suburbs of Vancouver, in schools and communities. You saw these really sort of arrogant pro-China counter protesters. So you'd have the pro-democracy, pro-Hong Kong guys, outside the Chinese consulate in Vancouver. And then all of a sudden these thugs would show up in their fancy sports cars, blaring out the Chinese national anthem, trying to drown out the protesters and waving the Chinese flag and pushing pro-communist propaganda here in Canada. And, I think the idea for so many Canadians, you kind of think, look, people who move to Canada, they do it because they love our values and they want to participate in our democracy and they believe in the foundations of Canada. And then when you see people behaving that way, and it went far beyond that, there was some stories about bullying and threats and aggression at high schools. There was one Hong Kong protester or activist who was at a high school in Richmond, and someone posted a threat on his locker that basically said that the Chinese government was watching him and so on. And you kind of go, wow, this is happening in our own backyard. And that was right out in the open. These people were not afraid at all to show where their affinity really lied. And so I really feel for Chinese Canadians or Canadians of Chinese ethnic origin who want to fight back and want to stand up against their government and their former government, I should say, and to see the Trudeau government kind of ignore the problems and try to promote this friendship is really disturbing. What do you think of that?
Yeah, and I think authoritarians are obviously emboldened by weakness, and there seems to be sometimes just a lack of understanding of basic human nature by the Trudeau government. It's like, so someone bullies you and you give them what they want. What lesson have you just taught them? Well, bullying works, right? So, they take two Canadians, they kidnap two Canadians, and then we keep being nice to them. We say we want to trade more with them. We partner on a vaccine with them. We never criticize them. So what lesson are they learning? The worse they treat Canada, the more they get what they want. So that just makes it more dangerous for the rest of us. If you look at history, every time an authoritarian really, people stand up against them. That's what authoritarians are afraid of, right? They use fear to keep everyone quiet and silent, and that's what they're trying to do to Canada. It's what they're trying to do to Australia and Europe, pressuring them to change their statements or their reports on the virus. So I think we need to be a lot tougher. And I think for a certain subset of Canadians, there's kind of this pathological niceness, like, oh, we're the nice country. You can be nice and still be strong at the same time, but a lot of people seem to assume niceness means we never stand up for anything, we never criticize anybody, we never take a stand. And I think China just looks at that and says, here's a country that looks weak and we can take advantage of them, get a bunch of resources, get military information, and have a foothold right next to the United States, who obviously China's trying to supplant as the most powerful country. So I think we need to wake up to basic human nature and realize that if we keep giving in to China, it's just going to get worse and worse for us.
Absolutely. And I think that the sort of pathological niceness that Canadians have has unfortunately been mixed up in this weird stew of identity politics and sort of left-wing, the accusations, like even just the conversation that we're having and talking about the concern that you might have with pro-communist protesters showing up at a rally. A lot of Canadians who might not have the sophistication or might just not understand the issues, they might take a step back and say, oh, wow, that's racist. You can't criticize China. And you have China kind of pushing that narrative as well, that if you were to take up safeguards, or the point that you made earlier in the interview about how part of the problem for Canada was that we just didn't lock down travel, we didn't lock down our borders. Well, at the time in January, when Donald Trump announced a ban of flights from China, he was routinely written off as being racist and xenophobic, and it was the Chinese government that was pushing that message that this all kind of comes down to prejudice. There was a German newspaper that suggested that China pay reparations to Europe for the destruction taken by COVID-19, and the Chinese government responded again saying that they were promoting prejudice against ethnically Chinese people. So they manipulate our sensibilities in the West and the sort of woke culture that's happening of pushing identity politics and division. They play off that. I think it's a bit more sophisticated than most Canadians even imagine. What do you think?
Yeah, well, if you look, it's not just, that a lot of people in the country think that way. It's that the people at the top think that way. I mean, remember, and as I'm sure you know well, when the virus was first starting to become a clear threat and people said, oh, why don't you shut the border down? Maybe don't let flights in from China. People said, and like people at the top, like Theresa Tam, Patty Hajdu, Justin Trudeau, I think John Tory in Toronto, said, "Oh, the real threat is stigma. Stigma is more dangerous than the virus." Like, I'm sure, yeah, tell that to all the people who've died and have lost family members, that stigma was a bigger threat than the virus. So this is where, again, we wouldn't have needed all these lockdowns. We wouldn't have had as much damage as we've had if these people just had basic common sense, which is, okay, you know what? If there's one country where a very deadly virus is originating from, it actually makes sense to be a little concerned about letting people in from that country. It's not like the people all of a sudden, oh, they're racist all of a sudden because they're worried about China. No, they were worried about China because a lot of people in China were dying of a deadly virus. So it's another problem where you see a lot on the left, kind of this push against basic human instinct almost, right? Like the threat response, like, okay, people are sick in a country, don't let them into this country. And they say, oh no, you can't think that way, that's racist, that's prejudice. It's kind of ignoring the basic human instincts that keep people alive. And we've seen the consequence of that.
Yeah, we're all sort of walking on eggshells, or at least the leaders, the left-wing leaders of our country would rather walk around on eggshells than do the hard news thing. I'm glad you mentioned Theresa Tam, because I think there's been a bit of a divide in Canada. I mean, so we'll kind of jump to it. You know, we're in the middle of a conservative leadership race, and one of the conservative candidates, Derek Sloan, kind of came out with this rant saying, you know, the job of the top health officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, has been terrible. She's incompetent. She's been relying on information from the World Health Organization, which seems to be compromised from China. She's got to go. And the reaction from the mainstream media and from elites and even members of his own party, other conservatives, have sort of denounced this line of reasoning as being racist and saying, you know, just because Theresa Tam is ethnically Chinese, and I think she was born in Hong Kong, you know, to question her loyalty and ask whether she's loyal to Canada or China is obviously racist. Whereas other people might say, well, look, she's a top health officer of the country. She's made all kinds of terrible recommendations. She recommended keeping the borders open at a time when places like Taiwan were closing the border. She first recommended against wearing masks, even though we now know that masks drastically reduce the chance of getting coronavirus when you're out and about. And then she reversed on that. I mean, you could realistically just look at her performance and say she's incompetent, she's got to go. But then you have this horde of people who are just saying, you know, this line of reasoning is completely unacceptable. So what did you make of that whole debacle? And do you think Sloan is right, or do you think that he's not being sensitive enough here?
Well, I think he wouldn't have had any trouble if he had simply said, who are Theresa Tam, Patty Hajdu, and Justin Trudeau working for? Are they working for Canada or China? The fact that he just said Theresa Tam makes it easy for people to play the racism. I don't think he's racist at all. I don't think it was a racist comment. But it makes it easier for people to say that, right? So he could have just mentioned all of them and raised those questions because they're really all to blame. They all made serious mistakes. When it comes to the advice that was given, I mean, I've said this before, there were random people on Twitter giving much more sensible advice than we got from, you know, the chief public health officer and from Trudeau and from Patty Hajdu. You know, they listen to the WHO, and you see these things where they say, oh, we're going to be combating misinformation on Twitter. Only official information on the coronavirus will be acceptable. Well, so would that be when the WHO said not to wear masks, or when they said to wear masks, when they said border controls wouldn't work, or they do work now? I mean, they've kept changing their story. And one thing that Theresa Tam said that really concerned me, and this was a few months ago when it wasn't really in Canada, she said Canada can't really act differently than the rest of the world or will be called to account, which shows that her main concern was political. It was, how is Canada going to be? Are we going to be criticized by the WHO? Are international institutions going to be upset? And, you know, her job is not to worry about politics. Her job is to worry about health, you know. So if you look at the numbers and say, here's a very controversial move, we're going to shut down the borders and we're going to save thousands of lives and people will be upset about it. Well, then you take that recommendation to the Prime Minister. And if Trudeau goes against it, then it's on him. But for the Chief Public Health Officer and for also Patty Hajdu to say, talking about racism and stigma and prejudice, that's not their job. That's not their purview. It's someone else's job to talk about that. Their job is to worry about the health of the country. And at the critical moment when, you know, 1 or 2 days makes a huge difference, they were focused on the wrong thing. Political correctness, you know, people's feelings, sensitivity, as opposed to protecting the country.
I completely agree. I think Patty Hajdu was constantly talking about sort of politicized ideas, even from the very beginning when her recommendations said not to close the border. part of her rationale was that she didn't want a stigma created against ethnically Chinese people living in Canada or Canadians. And again, that's not a health advice. That's a sociology analysis. That's for someone else. I think you're right. But Spencer, just to take it back to the Conservative leadership race, you had Sloan make those comments, and I think you could fairly say, look, if you're going to talk about these issues, you got to do it carefully. You got to make sure that you're choosing your words carefully, and that you're not accidentally questioning her loyalty to two countries. But yeah, you're making it more broad about the federal government's response. But what did you make of the idea that so many conservatives who were in the race, including, or not in the race, but other conservative MPs, the interim leader Andrew Scheer, they weren't willing to defend Sloan, or at least even explain his line of reasoning and sort of talk about why that was legitimate. But so many were willing to sort of jump on the left-wing mob of sort of cancel culture to say, yeah, this person who represents a large part of our party and is fairly popular among the party base, yeah, he's racist. Like, how do we find ourselves in the situation where conservatives don't stand up for conservatives?
Yeah, well, I think, it seems there's been some reports of kind of the Ontario caucus trying to kick him out. And apparently Erin O'Toole was the only one who voted against removing it, or voted against making him apologize or something. So it looks like at least internally Erin O'Toole showed at least a little bit of backbone. I know some of the leadership candidates didn't criticize, but yeah, Scheer did, and some of the other MPs. And it's what I just don't get is, how have they not figured out like one of the most basic political moves, which is just to pivot and like redirect what people are talking about? Like, it makes no sense. So multiple stories came out about a week later about how the Ontario caucus wanted to remove him. Almost everyone in the country had forgotten about that story already, so they brought it back up into the media. I don't know why they don't just respond when someone says, okay, Andrew Scheer, what do you think about Derek Sloan's comments? Was he a racist? Should he resign? And said, I'm glad to answer that question when Justin Trudeau and Patty Hajdu apologized for insinuating that Canadians who wanted border controls were racist, until putting those border controls in a few weeks later, when in many ways it was too late. So when they apologize for that, we'll discuss that other issue. So the media would get upset about it, but it would direct attention towards what people should be talking about, which is the failure of the Trudeau government. So they seem to constantly fall for the trap of, oh, the media is really upset about something. The Liberals are really upset. We better apologize and we better win over the media. But they never do. It's like Lucy with the football, right? Every time, oh, maybe the media will like us this time. Oh, no, we got to do something else. Oh, next time they'll like us. And it never works for them. So I think they need to get a lot tougher and start, pushing back and pivoting to other issues. Absolutely. And we know that the media's favorite job is not holding the government that actually has power and control over our lives and power of government. The media doesn't like holding the Liberals to account. They love holding the opposition Conservative and backbench MPs to account. I don't think that's going to change. But out of the four main candidates, so at this point we have four candidates left standing. We have Peter MacKay, Erin O'Toole, Derek Sloan, and Leslyn Lewis. Do you see in any of those four the potential of someone who can do what you just described, stand up to the mainstream media, kind of say, look, I don't care what the Liberal narrative in the mainstream media is. I care about Canadians. Do you see that ability in any of the four? Yeah, well, I think Erin O'Toole and Leslyn Lewis to me are the most interesting. For Leslyn Lewis, I think she would just be a surprise to a lot of Liberals. They wouldn't know how to use the same attacks, right? Oh, the Conservatives they hate women and people of minority. Oh, wait, no, we can't really say it, right? So the left would have a lot of trouble with that. I think regardless of what happens, she should definitely have a prominent role in the party going forward. And she's actually brought forward a lot of interesting ideas, kind of more populist ideas, which I think is a direction the Conservatives need to move into. I think with Erin O'Toole, his approach has been pretty tough. If you look at a lot of his videos and tweets, the question is if he wins, will he continue that or kind of go to a more soft approach? But he also served in the military, so I think having someone who's clearly demonstrated patriotism and serving the country would be a nice change politically as well. So yeah. We'll see. I mean, a lot depends on their advisors too, right? I mean, I think Scheer got some terrible advice in the last election, still seems to be getting some terrible advice now, and we'll see if that happens again. It's a shame that, our politics is so contrived now that it comes down to, the advice of advisors and not really the character and personality of the leaders themselves. So I want to get to Leslyn Lewis in a minute, but
for Aaron O'Toole, I mean, a lot of what he's saying sounds good to me. He sounds, strong and sort of putting forth this idea that he's a true blue conservative and that, he's going to maintain this record once he becomes leader. If he does, some people are accusing him of sort of painting himself as a more hardcore right winger in this election selection or this candidate selection process, where he didn't really do that last time, and he's sort of trying to say, no, my positions are the same. Do you think he's genuine? Do you think if he wins, we're going to get a lot of the policies that he's proposing, or do you think it'll be something more like a bait and switch? Because I did feel like with Andrew Scheer, he was proposing some pretty solid things when he was running for leader. He was talking about free speech on campus. He was talking about, defunding the CPC and all kinds of stuff. And then when he became leader, he sort of became this timid, manipulated by his advisors, and he didn't seem genuine or authentic. Do you think that's the path we're headed down if Aaron O'Toole is elected, or do you think he's more genuine?
Well, I mean, I'd hesitate to say any politician is really genuine. I mean, they're all calculating. In many ways, they all got there by calculating their way to positions of power in the first place. Some are genuine to a different degree, obviously, some more than others. But I think a lot will depend on, people like yourself, people like myself holding him accountable, right? So this is where, the problem with the lack of, or with the conservatives not really embracing independent media, is that they paint themselves into a corner where to win the leadership race, you have to be very conservative. But then they feel to win the election, you have to appease the media, right? So I think the real question is, will people like us hold them accountable? And I think if O'Toole gets in, say he gets in, and he starts backtracking on all the stuff he talked about, but then he gets a furious backlash from conservatives and from independent media, that might push him back in more of the direction he campaigned on. So I think a lot of it's still up in the air. Politicians do what they have to do to try to win. They try to gauge where public opinion is, where their party base is. And, it depends how much pressure they get and how much pressure they feel to actually live up to what they said they were going to do.
And how about Peter MacKay? Do you think that, he's sort of been ignoring independent media. I know Aaron O'Toole was recently did an interview with True North's Andrew Lawton, but I don't think that Peter MacKay is willing to go down that path. So do you think we'll be in the same situation if Peter MacKay is chosen leader? Do you think that he'll listen to independent media?
Well, it doesn't seem like it. If he's not willing to even talk to independent media during the campaign, when he's trying to win over conservatives, I can't see him doing that much if he becomes the leader of the party. And so I think, there seems to be this calculation that, they just need to, try to go, as they say, to the center. But the liberals keep moving the center, right? The liberals are doing things now that would have been seen as far left 4 or 5 years ago. And so the center has shifted. So if you keep moving to the center, supposedly, then you just kind of do what the liberals want. The other problem, if he's not willing to confront the, or to talk to, independent media, he's just going to get chewed up by the establishment media. He's going to make the same mistake. Oh, they'll like me. I'm a different kind of conservative. They'll like me. This will go well this time. And it never does. The thing I think conservatives have to realize is no matter who you are or how you campaign, they're going to call you an extreme far-right conservative. They're going to paint Peter MacKay as that, regardless of whether it's true or not. So you may as well at least, be true to the party base, expand the party base by, convincing people that ideas are important, and you have to fight back somewhat against the establishment media. Just trying to give in to them all the time and hope they'll like you, it hasn't worked out too well.
Right. It reminds me of Mitt Romney, the Republican nominee for president back in 2012, who, if you look at Mitt Romney today, he's seen as a squishy, flaky, sort of liberal Republican at the sort of far left end of the party who won't even vote in solidarity with Republicans a lot of the time. And yet when he was the Republican nominee for president running against Barack Obama, they threw the same insults at him that they threw at Trump, calling him a fascist, calling him far right and dangerous and out of touch and all this stuff. It's like, it doesn't matter. As long as you have that R before your name, that's what they're going to call you. And I think that conservatives would be wise to learn that the same phenomenon is at play here in Canada, if not worse. You said earlier that you thought that Leslie Lewis was proposing some kind of exciting new populist proposals, and that was the direction that you think that the party should be moving in. Can you give us some examples of what it means to be a populist and what kind of ideas you think the party should be embracing?
Yeah, well, I think one, the party's been very much kind of into this orthodoxy on trade, right? Like more free trade is always good. And that included for a long time the idea of free trade with China, right? Which I think the world has realized is a serious problem. And you see, unfortunately, a lot of communities in Canada have been really broken apart. A lot of good jobs have been taken away, replaced with either no jobs or, jobs that are just way less secure, provide way less meaning for people. And the country's become vulnerable. So I think part of populism, or you could even talk about economic nationalism, is realizing that having a strong nation is important, which is something conservatives used to talk about. It kind of shifted to, okay, it's all free market all the time, free trade with everybody, international institutions, which is not always compatible with, a strong nation. And there's a bit of a hypocrisy where, you have conservatives talk about free trade with other countries, but we don't even have free trade within Canada, right? Provinces. There's still a lot of barriers. So I think that's one thing they need to look at. I think also if you look at the way the conservatives talk about finances, right? It's very interesting if you look at what both Donald Trump and Boris Johnson did when they got elected. It's not exactly that they were big spenders, but they were not obsessed with the debt and deficit the way previous conservatives have been. They talked about spending on helping citizens. They talked about, of course, not spending on illegal immigrants. So that was one change, one thing they talked about. Making citizenship have meaning. Trump, I remember in one debate, he was talking about healthcare cuts with, I think, Rubio and Ted Cruz. And Trump basically said, call it what you want. And they were starting to call him a socialist. So they're like, oh, this isn't a Republican idea. And he said, call it what you want. We're not going to let our citizens die on the streets, right? So I think conservatives need to realize that a lot of people think the government has a duty to protect citizens and take care of citizens. And they need to make that case a little bit better because they often seem like they're just out of touch. I mean, Scheer's out there today not talking about China, but he's talking about the CERB, talking about fraudsters. And yeah, I get the point he's trying to make, but to a lot of people, it just looks like he's criticizing the idea of giving money away, right? And, it might be cynical, but if the conservatives are constantly seen as scolding the government, and then Justin Trudeau is going around saying, oh, we're helping everybody, we're helping all our citizens get through this difficult time, Justin Trudeau is going to win that argument. Might not be fair, might not be factually correct, but he's going to win that argument. So I think they need to look at what some leaders have done in other countries, whether it's, it wouldn't be the same approach as Trump or Boris Johnson, but there are some ideas there, which is take care of your own citizens. The nation has to be strong. You have to protect people. And I think that people are also looking for a sense of community. So this kind of, free market, big corporation, endless free trade thing, it's not really that popular. And it hasn't worked in some cases. It works if we're trading with, say, the US or the UK, very different story. Free trade there is quite good. Free trade with China just means China says, oh, okay, great, yeah, we'll partner with you, but you have to let your company be 50% owned by China, and you have to give all your intellectual property, and then we're going to give billions of government support to copy your product and mass produce it, then we'll sell it back to you at a lower price because we can accept a loss, and then your companies are out of business and you're buying all our stuff, and you're dependent on us for personal protective equipment. Oh, great deal. So there needs to be a little bit more, I think, of an understanding that we need to have a strong country, and that some of the economic orthodoxy that conservatives still seem, tied to is not popular and really hasn't worked.
You raised just so many great points there, Spencer. I feel like the international consensus, the Washington consensus of international institutions has been so corrupted just by the idea that initially the sort of rules-based system post-World War II and sort of, the world order that came out of that with the United Nations and all these other organizations was the idea that it was a coalition of like-minded liberal democracies that were creating these rules that were clearly understood so that we could better engage and get along with each other. The World Trade Organizations similarly had basically these principles of reciprocity and openness and transparency that relied on liberal, basically the idea that it would be a group of liberal democracies. But we've opened it up to all of these, again, like you're describing, kind of corrupt, manipulative, authoritarian governments that are willing to just absolutely change the playing field and change the rules. So it isn't really about the principles, the economic principles, which potentially could be sound. It's like we've allowed ourselves to be manipulated. And interestingly, it used to be conservative orthodoxy that promoted all of these ideas. And now it's sort of become the liberal mainstream orthodoxy that, big businesses and corporations and open trade and unlimited trade is the way to go. And I feel like conservatives need to come up with an alternative, like you said, that focus on communities and families and making sure that people just have good paying jobs. What do you think the government can do to promote things like community and to make sure that small cities in Canada, small towns maintain the character of being able to provide good paying jobs to people sort of across the spectrum, not just, the highly educated people who go into sort of the high tech jobs, but everybody. What do you think that the government does have a role then in sort of fostering these smaller towns and fostering a sense of community? And if so, how can they do that?
Well, I think they do, and I think there's a few ways. One would be tariffs, and obviously you can't put tariffs on everything, but I think you look and say, here's some strategic sectors we want to build in Canada, things that we need, things that if they were cut off from foreign countries would cause a big problem, which means you have to build it at home. So you say, okay, well, we're going to have to put some tariffs on products and use some of that tariff revenue to provide temporary support to get some businesses and companies running. Another thing is immigration. This is very interesting. If you look at the left in the past, especially labor unions, they were not fans of massive immigration because they said, look, a certain amount of immigration can be helpful. Canada does have a very low birth rate. That's an issue the government should address as well. If people had more money, there'd probably be more large families. But, some immigration is helpful and necessary. And, it's good that we bring people in. But if you look at Canada's numbers, we're bringing in about 1/3 as many people as the United States. The U.S. is already a high immigration country. So with about 1/10 of the population, we're bringing in 1/3 as many people. So that's a huge amount of people every year. And when you do that, you often just dilute the labor market. So it's great for big companies because you have a whole bunch of people with very little bargaining power. So wages are low, people are desperate, they'll take whatever they can get. But labor unions used to be against that. They wanted to maximize the leverage of workers. They wanted higher wages, but now, as you see, especially with the NDP and Jagmeet Singh, they kind of move in a more woke direction, right? So it's not even traditional labor politics anymore. It's something quite strange. But I think the government does have a role, and another important thing is decentralization. The government brings in a lot of tax revenue every year. If that was given directly to municipalities and provinces, then they could make better decisions for themselves, and you'd see more creativity, as opposed to kind of this top-down, oh yeah, we'll just decide everything from the top approach that really often doesn't work. So I think the lesson is almost more, I don't know what to call it, but more of a national strategy when it comes to trading with other countries and saying these are some key resources, these are companies and resources we need to protect. But then at the local level, way more local freedom, more freedom for municipalities, more revenue for them, more freedom for provinces. And I think that's really the mix we need to go towards, which interestingly enough is actually more the way the Canadian system was intended to be in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's the right approach, that having sort of a weak federal government, this is where Canada differs from the United States. The U.S. has a strong federal government that has, just so many powers and abilities, and so many things in Canada that are managed by the local governments in the U.S. are managed by the federal government. We're lucky in that we don't have that system of strong federal government. And I think conservatives should advocate for what you're saying, which is more sort of local control. One other question from what you were talking about there, one of the justifications for mass immigration is that Canada has a declining birth rate. And it seems, that's the all-party consensus that, we're just sort of going to live with the fact that Canadians aren't having as many kids. We're not anywhere near replacement levels in terms of families. And sort of, instead of trying to address that problem and do something about it, we're sort of resigned to, okay, we'll just sort of import millions of people from all over the world to make up for it. Why doesn't the government try to do something more actively pro-family? And if so, what kind of policies would you think would be the right way to go?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is political correctness. I think for the Liberals, the concern is if they started talking about pro-family measures, that might be seen as, oh, that's too conservative, or you don't like immigrants or something? Oh, why are you talking about that? And for the Conservatives, it's, the issue is, they'll be accused of being anti-immigrant if they want to help Canadians, right? The irony, of course, is Canada's already an extremely diverse country. So if you talk about helping Canadian citizens, you're talking about really helping all kinds of people. So it's not like just one group anymore. So I think some of the, there's direct baby bonuses, you can call that, right? Payment supports, those do tend to be popular, expensive, obviously. But a big part is the labor market, right? I mean, if you have a situation where all the jobs for young people are basically low security, no benefits, very low wages, it's tough for them to ever accumulate capital, buy a house, start a family. And it's the same problem. Then you bring in more people, which then lowers their wages even further, and the problem keeps happening. And so you see on the left politicians who seem either they don't understand it or they just choose not to understand it, where they say, well, we're going to increase the minimum wage. We mandate a higher minimum wage. And then they keep bringing in hundreds of thousands of people. So you're just going to get people fired in that case. You're not actually going to increase wages. Just a lot of people lose their jobs. So I think recognizing the relationship between wages, immigration, and yes, there's going to need to be some direct government support. I mean, if the government wants people to be able to afford bigger families, then there needs to be some support. That's something both the Conservatives and Liberals have done in different ways, but they both did the same thing, and it's pretty popular when they do it. So they just have to accept that might be the price of changing things.
Yeah, it's like they do it without acknowledging it. Like I have lots of friends in the States that they're having kids right now and having babies, and you compare the situation in the U.S. to Canada. I mean, like I think that the federal government in the U.S. mandates like something like 6 or 8 weeks of maternity leave for mothers, which is a wildly short period of time for a new mom to have to transition to going back to the workforce. Whereas in Canada, you get up to a year, and you can even defer it and take 18 months. You know, we have all of these Canadian family benefits, monthly checks for kids that the U.S. wouldn't even dream of having. So those would be considered like left-wing ideas in the U.S. and in Canada. We already have them. So I feel like there is a lot of stuff that's already done, but I would agree that the government can and probably should, especially conservatives, promote the idea of strong families and strong communities. So, sir, before we wrap things up, I did want to spend some time talking to you about the local or the media landscape for independent media. We talked about it a little earlier when we were talking about how independent media plays such an important role in holding conservatives to account. But I think part of the problem is just that the playing field is so tilted against us. When you look at sort of some of the recent initiatives of the Trudeau government, the huge government bailout, the idea that the CPC gets more and more money and therefore more and more credibility during the press conferences, the daily press conferences Trudeau's been doing throughout the COVID-19 crisis. The CBC has been called on to ask about 20%, 22%, something like that, of all questions asked. So, Trudeau's not even letting independent guys have the ability to ask questions. The big guys are dominating it even more and more. What do you think independent media can do to fight back? And what do you think, just more broadly, what is the role of independent media and independent journalists in Canada?
Well, I think a big part of the role is just to represent what most Canadians are actually thinking and feeling. I think if you look at how the conversation on social media shifted, right? So when it was being used by the Liberals effectively, when it was being used by Barack Obama and the Democrats, it was great. Social media, it's democracy in action. People are free to share their views. And then when you had election results go against what the elites wanted, Brexit and then Donald Trump, social media is a real threat. This is very dangerous. We need to do something. So it's not about them actually being afraid of social media per se. It's just they're afraid of losing control over the information environment. So you see the same thing. Fewer and fewer people watch the CBC, and they keep getting more and more money, which is interesting. Newspapers that can't sell, people that can't get any attention, they get more money from the government to keep pushing the same stuff. People are saying they don't want it, but the government says, oh, you do want it, and you're going to pay for it whether you like it or not. So I think for independent media, it's representing what people think. If you just look at the engagement on Twitter, what you'll get on your tweets, what I'll get on my tweets, thousands of retweets in some cases. And then you see, official CBC reporter, 100,000 followers, and they tweet something, 2 retweets. It's like, okay, there's no real actually engagement or support for that. In terms of the landscape, it is somewhat threatening what the government's trying to do. I think they're slowly, it's like the boiling the frog thing, right? If they just banned it right away, people would go crazy. But if they slowly kind of chip away at it and shut it down over time, make it just tougher and tougher, they hope they can shut it down, and I think that's what they're trying to do.
Well, I think that not enough attention has been shined on this, and it's partially because we slipped into the coronavirus pandemic, which has taken over every aspect of media coverage and that's just sort of the dialogue that Canadians are having in public conversation. But back in January of this year, Spence, you probably remember this. The government, what they had done was they commissioned a panel to look into the sort of the media landscape. And we've heard Trudeau government talk about this a lot, that they want to sort of move into a more regulatory role for media to dispel fake news and to make sure that outlets are transparent and that the information they're providing is correct. We're talking about this even with regards to coronavirus. But anyway, back in January, there was a report that came out through the CRTC recommending changes to the Broadcasting Act. The panel was led by an individual named Janet Yale. And I mean, if we go back to that report, it's just absolutely staggering, some of the recommendations. I mean, it's so Orwellian, so authoritarian, so counter to Canadian democracy, just in terms of the idea of requiring media companies to have licenses through the government for all kinds of new regulations and rules governing who is and who isn't a journalist. Yeah, that shouldn't be the government's role to determine who is and who isn't a journalist who's holding them accountable. I mean, you just simply have a situation where liberals would only choose other liberals to be journalists, and then conservatives would come back and do the same thing. I mean, this is a dangerous path, and it hasn't gotten much attention now, albeit the recommendations haven't been put into effect yet. So perhaps when the government does announce legislation, there will be some uproar about this. But privately, I hear from a lot of Canadians who are just very concerned and worried about the future of media, given the Trudeau government's willingness to introduce stuff like this and broaden the conversation to the fact that we're actually talking about whether or not the government should regulate who is and who isn't a journalist, and what fees and what taxes and what regulations they should follow. Do you find this to be a threat to democracy, or do you think it's all overblown?
I find it very concerning. I mean, one of the basic ideas of a free and democratic society is the government is held accountable in large part by the media. So if the government gets to control what the media is and who's in the media, then that's not really free media, right? Or independent media. So I think it's a big problem, and I think it's, back to the whole boil the frog thing. I think what they're going to do is they'll just separate. They started talking about it, and they got a huge backlash, and then all this other stuff happened, obviously. So I think what they'll do is they're just going to do it piece by piece, right? They'll bring in one piece of legislation, put it in an omnibus bill, then if they get some backlash, back off, and then put it somewhere else. So the bigger problem is not just the report, but the fact that first they would commission it, and then the fact that they didn't just outright say this is unacceptable in a free country, right? This is obviously what they want to do, and they just wait for their moment to get away with it. So I think we all have to be very vigilant, and we have to generate outrage if they do try to bring it up again, because a country where the government controls the media, that's what you expect in China. I mean, that's exactly how China works, right? China gets to decide who the media is. I mean, Xi Jinping will go into like a big broadcast center and will tell them what they should be reporting on. So it's obvious, like, they work for him. And it's not that way yet in Canada, but any movement in that direction is something we need to fight against.
Well, it does sometimes feel that way, Spencer, especially, we've had a little glimpse into the media's chummy relationship with Justin Trudeau through these daily press conferences. And I don't know if you recall, but earlier when the Conservatives tried to introduce a plan to get back into Parliament, there were all kinds of just really negative news stories, nasty columns written by sort of the usual suspects over at the Toronto Star and other places, sort of saying, wow, that's so reckless and so irresponsible to want to go back to question period. We're all just fine with this current arrangement. Trudeau does answer questions. It's called his daily media briefings. And Susan Delacour at the Star said, questions are necessary, but question period is not. So saying, the whole role of Parliament isn't even that necessary so long as Trudeau is being held to account by the media. And then we learn that these media scrums are completely managed and manipulated by liberal partisan staffers in the PMO who, like I said, 21% of the time they're calling on the CBC. If you go through, True North did a report, Blacklocks, which is another independent media outlet, did their own report showing that, I think the Toronto Sun, which is the paper I write for as well, which leans conservative, it's sort of a conservative populist magazine or journal newspaper. They only got 4 questions. The CBC got like 180 questions. So the PMO is already determining who gets to ask questions, and you see it in the way that stories are written about it. You remember over Easter, Justin Trudeau broke some social distancing laws and went to Quebec after telling Canadians not to go to their cottages. And he crossed a boundary that was actually closed. Canadians couldn't get in their cars and drive. But I guess when the Prime Minister's motorcade pulled up, they opened the barriers and let him on through. But the big story from the CBC that weekend was that Andrew Scheer got on a private plane with his family. Mm-hmm. And the whole report was question after question after question for Andrew Scheer, which every question seemed to have a reasonable explanation. And then at the very bottom, like very last sentence, it said, Trudeau was also getting slack, but he said he was following the guidelines and he wasn't breaking any rules. And then there was no investigation. There was no follow-up. There were no, questions about what rules he may have hypothetically broken. So it's just such a black and white, night and day difference between the way that the media question the opposition compared to Trudeau. So I fear that we are already at that position. He's not as brazen as the Chinese communist government, but the same stuff is happening behind the scenes, and Canadians just aren't aware of it. Again, what can independent media do to kind of tilt the playing field a little more in our favor?
Yeah, this is where it may sound strange to people, but I think some of the blame for this, obviously the Liberals for the most part, but I think the Conservative Party has made some mistakes here. For one, they raise tens of millions of dollars every year. So why have they not yet built up a massive social media platform, right? Why? I mean, they often get ratioed on their tweets, so they have a lot of people following them who don't support them. They're not obviously reading the room, right? You see a lot of their recent tweets are not going well. How have they not paid someone to figure that out for them? How have they not reached out to independent? So Andrew Scheer will do a press conference, as you say. He gets a bunch of unfair questions, right? So why wasn't the Rebel invited to the press conference? Why wasn't True North invited to the press conference? Send someone, send me there, send somebody there, right? You don't even have to shut out the establishment media, but you just dilute it. So you bring in 10 independent media organizations and you split the questions between them and the establishment media. And then the press gallery will say, oh, no, this is unfair, or the press gallery gets to decide. You can't legally stop someone from walking into a room and asking the opposition leader, in this case, questions. And if they try to do that, then you turn it back on the media. Say, so how come you guys are okay with Xinhua News, run by Communist China? Why are you okay with them being in the parliamentary press gallery, right? But True North isn't, or the Rebel isn't, or all these Canadian-run organizations are not? So I think that's a question you need to force the media to answer, and the Conservatives really need to realize, look, there's already a group of people, a growing group of people, independent media in the country, who are much more willing to give them a fair shake, to listen to them, have millions of people combined who watch and listen and read their reports. Why are you ignoring them? Just make them a part of the media. And the irony is, the more they do that, the Conservatives do that, and then the establishment media will go crazy and will write a bunch of articles about why this is unacceptable, right? But in writing all those articles, they'll print the name of all these new organizations, and a bunch of people who've never heard of them will see it for the first time and say, oh, maybe I'll check this out. So just by making them fight against each other, you'll get more attention for independent media. So I don't know why the Conservatives haven't really figured that out yet. My concern is they're just going to think, oh, this time's going to be different. This time we'll win over the media. And if you look objectively, and I know a lot of Conservatives may not like to hear it, but the Conservatives have won one majority government in the last 20 years. And the one they won it was when they were running around the country giving out huge checks to people. Everyone forgets in the 2011 election, I think the budget deficit was about 50 or $40 billion. They were doing all those things. They'd go to a community center, an arena with a novelty check, government economic action plan, $50 million, right? So the one election they won big, they were giving out money to everybody. And so the media likes covering that, right? It makes it easy to get attention. The next two elections, they talked about balancing the budget and the debt and all that stuff, and they lost. So the Conservatives, I think they misread the 2011 election and thought, oh, we figured out how to win over the media. We figured out how to win over Canadians, and they assumed it was some sort of mandate for all their ideas, and then they got smoked the next two times. So they keep refighting the same election without building a media infrastructure in between. And then they find themselves in the same problem as, okay, our base wants us to do this, but if we do this, the media gets upset, so we'll try to appease the media, but the media will never be happy because we can never go as far left as the Liberals or NDP, and they just kind of get screwed over all over the place. And I fear they're going to make that same mistake again by saying, oh, independent media, oh, it's not too big right now. We'll just go to the big networks and the big newspapers, without realizing that there's millions of people who are reading independent media in Canada. And if they can appeal to that audience and enlarge that audience, they can really give themselves a big boost when they face the next election. Or they'll just have to get screwed over by the media again, and maybe they'll learn it next election cycle. So we'll see.
Well, I hope you're right, and I hope that the Conservatives are listening and that they do take on some of those tips that you gave. I mean, True North does go to Andrew Scheer's press conference and we get a question or two in, but I would agree that I would love to see Scheer stand up to the Parliamentary Press Gallery, which really is just a group of left-wing thugs that are protectionists and that don't want to expand the power that they have. And so, you have a situation like in the last election where True North wanted to participate in the leaders' debates, and we literally had to take them to court. And we won. A judge agreed that what they were doing in blocking True North and the Rebel was completely arbitrary. And for that reason, let us in. I think one of the big problems I see is that the Conservatives still go to the mainstream media, and not even just the mainstream media, the left-wing media, the Star, the CPC, when they have news, when they have stories. That's who they leak their stories to. That's who, they talk to insiders about what different campaigns are working on. And I feel like there's a group of people in Canada that are sort of these conservative insider elites that live in downtown Toronto, that, they're former staffers for various federal and provincial governments on the right, but essentially, in their own lives are cosmopolitan leftists. And, they're the ones that are kind of driving it because they're friends with the lobbyists and the journalists, and they kind of go out and have martinis together. And they're the reason that independent media get ignored, because they're leaking the stories to the Star because it's their friends that work at the Star. And I wish that there was sort of more of a populist revival within the party. And so, again, I'm not really seeing it out of any of these candidates, other than maybe, like you said, Leslyn Lewis, who is a bit of an outsider. Perhaps even if she doesn't win the leadership, she'll run and become a member of parliament and inject some of that populist spirit into the party because it's so needed. All right, Spencer. Well, before we wrap up here, we have a program at True North where club members, people who donate to True North on a monthly basis, get special access, insider access. If you're interested in joining one of these True North clubs, you can head on over to tnc.news/clubs. And basically they get special access and they get to ask questions. So we had a couple of questions for you from our club members. The first one comes from David in Coburn. He says, Spencer, who do you think should win the CPC leadership election?
Who do I think should win or will win?
Who should win?
Yeah, I'd have to say it's between Aaron O'Toole and Leslyn Lewis for me. I think they would both bring something new, either military service or someone who I think represents, a more diverse leader for the party, something the left would have a tough time attacking. She brings some interesting ideas, Leslyn Lewis. So I think should, one of the two. I don't think. I think Derek Sloan would get decimated in much of the country. His brand is severely damaged. He hasn't figured out. I mean, it's unfair to call him a racist, certainly, but he hasn't figured out a strategic way to talk about things, which is a bit of a problem for him. And Peter MacKay, I think, this idea that he's super electable, I just don't see that. I think the Conservative base will be demoralized if he pulls out a narrow win, because I think that's the only option. His support has declined a lot. And if you look at his social media game, it's been horrendous. I mean, I don't even know what they're doing there. And he's going to get attacked as a far right wing guy anyway. So he's going to get attacked as far right. The party base will be demoralized, and the communications will be pretty bad. So, maybe there'll be some sort of surprise, but that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, I think that the calculation behind Peter MacKay is totally wrong. The idea that, hey, look, the Conservatives already have all of Western Canada locked down. They're going to get every seat in Alberta no matter what. So they might as well get a guy from the east that could appeal and win some seats over there. I think that calculation is wrong, because I worry that under a Peter MacKay leader who brings a party back to the center, back to the left, you'll lose support from so many people out west that you might even see a split in the party or a new party pop up. That's just my 2 cents. Next question comes from Janet. Canada has seen a number of cases of fake outrage and cancel culture. It seems like almost an everyday occurrence now. The latest example was Bryan Adams. Why do you think this is happening, and what can Canadians do to stop it?
Well, I think a big part of it is how left-wing the media is, right? So you have someone like Bryan Adams, what he said, and I wrote an article saying, look, if you're outraged about something, you should be outraged at China, not at Bryan Adams. I think the vast majority of people would not be upset with what he said, but you have a small group of people on Twitter who are either close friends with or are the same people as who are in most of the media organizations. So they see 50 tweets of angry people, and then boom, all the articles. Oh, outrage, Canadians enraged at Bryan Adams, right? And then it becomes a self-perpetuating thing, right? People read articles saying how outraged everyone is, so people think, yeah, I'm also outraged now. This is crazy. So I think that's a big part of it. And again, stronger independent media pushes back against that. You saw more of a fight than you usually do. People pushing back, just like with Don Cherry. A lot of people who attacked him, there was a lot of a backlash to the attack on him. And it wasn't enough, obviously, to save his job. But it does show that I think independent media represents what just regular common sense Canadians are thinking. And a lot of people are tired with this whole cancel culture bullshit. And they want to push back against it. It's not at the point, right? I mean, we still see, what's that terrible show? The Talk? Is that what the one where?
Oh, I think The Social is what you're talking about.
The Social, oh yes.
The Canadian knockoff version of The View.
Yeah, so The Social, I mean, one of them said a whole bunch of terrible things. Didn't lose her job. Don Cherry does lose his job. So there's still, you see, with the establishment media, because it's I think owned by CTV, there still is obviously some bias in there and a double standard, but that's starting to shift, at least on social media. People push back and they realize that it makes no sense. They realize there's a double standard and they fight back against it. So I think the more independent media grows, the more there's going to be pushback to all the cancel culture stuff.
Absolutely. It seems like, Brian Adams just probably isn't a super savvy guy that spends all his time on social media. So when he went to express his outrage at the situation, it didn't come off as crisply as if you were, a liberal politician who had someone vetting it. All right. Final question here, Spencer. This comes from Adam in Hamilton. He says, Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives seem like they're kind of in a tough spot right now as the official opposition, or at least they get a ton of heat from the media. I know here in Ontario, the NDP have been relatively quiet, whereas the Conservatives seem pretty aggressive. What do you think of the official opposition? Should they be nice and join Team Canada, or should they continue to try to hold the government accountable?
I think they need to pick their battles. So they voted for the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which, if you look at the polls, is extremely popular. I mean, people are seeing economic damage like we've never seen before. And so to have the government supporting people is popular. And the Conservatives voted for the program. So it's very easy for them to say, yeah, we stand with the government on providing support to Canadians during this difficult time. We're going to make sure you get the support you need. And then just stop talking about it. Just leave that for a few months, right? But then on other issues like the border, like on China, that's an issue where they should keep attacking, right? So there's different issues. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. But if you have, 86% of Canadians saying they don't trust China, only 14% with a positive opinion, people don't want more trade with China, people want Huawei banned. These are all areas where the Conservatives can be more popular than the Liberals, and they should keep talking about it. So they need to pick their battles. You can talk about the border as well, the need for strong borders, which again feeds into what Conservatives have been saying. And what a lot of people are realizing is, yes, a nation needs borders, especially when there's a pandemic flowing in from other countries. So, yeah, I think, Team Canada is about providing support to Canadians. So, yes, absolutely, we're on Team Canada when it comes to supporting Canadians in this difficult time, and we'll always do that and then just stop talking about it because that's all you need to say. But then on other issues like the border or China, yeah, keep talking because there is important stuff to be said there.
Well, I think that the Conservatives would be very wise to listen to some of the advice that you're giving, Spencer. And, we really appreciate your time and your insight. I think that, we've talked about so many important issues. And again, I hope that some people who are running the Conservative Party are listening. And I hope that some of your ideas and suggestions about independent media come to fruition. So, Spencer Fernando, thank you so much for joining the Candace Malcolm Show and the True North Speaker Series. And we hope to talk to you again.
Yeah, it was great talking to you.